So, you guys might be able to tell I am a little bit sick today. And this actually relates to a topic that I'm currently obsessed with, which is basically air pollution and human health. So, I want to give in a minute a really, really strong book recommendation, one of the strongest book recommendations I could ever give, since I just read a book and I regard it as really unique in terms of making sense of air pollution, how to think about it, how to make policies about it. But before I tell you about the book, let me just tell you about my own context thinking about this, besides being sick at the moment. And it's that I'm working on Moral Case for Fossil Fuels version 2.0. And one of the sections that I really want to improve in the book is the section on non CO2 emissions. So there's a section on CO2 emissions and climate, and there's a lot I want to improve there. But probably the part of the first book I was least satisfied with was the section on other environmental issues. And those are really, really important for at least two reasons. One is that those it's really important to get environmental laws right, because on the one hand, it's really possible to have things like damaging air pollution, damaging water pollution, negative safety practices, and those can really make people sick or even kill people. So it's not like CO2, or CO2 is benign when it's around you. The only question is what happens in the global climate system. Like, there are these really powerful forces that can really harm people. So it's important to get that right, but then it's important to do that in a way that's not compromising in any significant way your ability to get abundant, reliable energy very, very affordably and on a large scale. And usually what happens is that the people talking about different kinds of environmental emissions and risks, the tendency tends to be to hugely exaggerate those risks. Often there's just a huge amount of sloppiness, including people act like all risks apply to all uses of fossil fuels. So they'll take like smog in China and say, oh, well, this is true of all fossil fuels. And well, no, it's clearly not true of natural gas or even oil or even modern coal plants. It's a specific use of coal in specific ways in China, which arguably you don't have to do. So there's just all this sloppiness about to what extent there's an issue, a complete misunderstanding of the modern technology and best practices that exist to minimize different kinds of side effects and risks. So it's hard on that end. And then on top of that, when people are thinking about these issues, so they're not precise about the negative byproducts of fossil fuels. And then people who are talking about the negative byproducts of fossil fuels almost never talk about the unique positives that come along with those byproducts. So when you are using coal plants, you have reasons to use coal plants. And for many people, that's by far the cheapest way of them getting electricity. And if you just look at what happens with the sulfur dioxide in the air, then you're not getting the whole story, because it's very, very possible that, particularly if you use a modern kind of plant, that even if there's something imperfect about the air emissions, that overall your life is much, much better, because when you have abundant, reliable energy, you have so much capability to improve your life in every different way. And so not only can you afford things to mostly neutralize things like smog, so that's what, China's starting to make cleaner air, but you can also offset or overwhelm negative impacts. For example, you can pay for better food, and you can pay for better shelter, you can pay for better medical care. And so overall, your life can be much, much better, even if you do have a certain amount of emissions that out of context is not good, but in context could be very good. So it's so, so hard to get people to talk about the fossil fuel emissions with precision and in context. Those are the two elements that I just find very difficult. And then that's really annoying, because these issues get very, very complicated very quickly. And it's kind of a pain to try to sort through them. And particularly since it's not my life's work to know all of the details of all of these things, it's hard to get the level of precision that I want. from experts, and let alone context, which most experts don't give you. And yet, occasionally in life, you'll find that in a particular field, there is somebody who looks at things with precision and context. And I remember for me in the field of energy was Peter Beckman of Access to Energy. He really had a different level of precision and context. Now, I haven't read most of the stuff I read. Most of the stuff I read by him was 10 years ago. So I may have different assessments of it now to some degree, but in general, he had a lot of precision and context. And part of that context is that his overarching priority was human life. And one problem you have with many thinkers today is that their overarching priority is minimizing human impact on nature. And that's, in my view, not the right priority. And it certainly leads to policies that are bad for human life. So now let me get to the thinker and the book that I'm really excited about. A few months ago or so, I saw a video by a guy named Robert Phalen, Phalen, and he happens to teach at the University of California at Irvine, which is pretty near where I live. So I'm hoping to meet him at some point soon. And he had this half an hour talk, which you can very easily find on YouTube because he only has 2 or 3 talks on YouTube, unfortunately. And I was just so impressed by the precision and context he gave when he was explaining certain things about what's called the PM controversy, particulate matter, which is a certain kind of air pollution. But part of the issue is it's very vaguely defined. It's defined primarily as the size of the compounds involved versus any particular chemical property, which, as he points out, is a very problematic way of defining something in the first place, because you could have a bunch of PM in different places, but it could be totally different things with totally different kinds of impacts on your body, and yet you're calling it all PM. So that's one of many things he pointed out. And I found this guy there. I could see that this was a super, super respected expert and had a lot of rigor, and yet he was completely unafraid of being iconoclastic. And I just noticed that the way he explained things was very precise and very in context. For example, he would just make the point in passing, but this is such an important point, that when you're making policies to reduce emissions, you need to look at the full benefits of those policies and also the full harms of those policies. And he mentioned things like the value of industry to human life and human health. And that is a kind of obvious thing, but rarely specialists, particularly who talk in the public, who are specialists in environmental issues, will very clearly state that we absolutely, when making these decisions, need to recognize the fundamental benefits of industry to human life. So I just thought, oh, there's something really remarkable about this guy in terms of his precision, his context, his pro-human orientation. And then I made a big mistake, which is basically that I didn't immediately read his stuff. And this is a big kind of mistake to make, and I hate when I make it, because when we find somebody who's on another level, I just find it so good to just immerse myself in that person, because there are very few people who are this good. So recent in the last week, I finally started reading one of his books, which is called, it's pretty much the Particulate Matter Air Pollution Controversy. Those words might be in a different order, but by Robert Phalen. And it's an amazing book. It's so good. There's this phenomenon that occasionally happens to me when I love a book, and this is the most extreme yet, where I highlight so much of it in Kindle that when I go to my online Kindle highlights, it just, by the end of the book, it just says, you can't see this, you can't see this, you can't see this, because you've highlighted too many things. Because I just found myself highlighting almost the entire book because it's so precise and it has so much context. He's just systematically looking at every aspect of air pollution and how it affects human life and what are the different policies to deal with it and how they affect human life. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of places where I think that it's unique. Actually, here's what I'll do. I'll just give you, he has a section which is fascinating near the end of the book where he talks about certain assumptions that are being made. And he just lists out these assumptions and then he questions them. So I'll just read you some of the assumptions, and maybe from this you can see, oh, this is a really interesting kind of thinker. So I'll give you several of the assumptions that he gives and then summarize what I think are some of the interesting views he says. So one is, he says, an agent shown to be toxic at high doses is also harmful at low doses. So this is something we've actually talked about on Power Hour before, which is the issue of thresholds of toxicity. And he points out that this belief, so all of these things are assumptions that he's questioning. An agent shown to be toxic at high doses is also harmful at low doses. And he questions that and shows that this is not the way that reality works. And yet so much of modeling of health is based on the idea that if a large quantity of something is harmful, then a small quality of something is harmful just to a lesser degree. And he has a related one, which is when large populations face small per person risks, the total risk is the product of the large number of people and the small risk per person. Now, this one's actually a little tricky, so I don't want to go too much into it, but he gives this really good example of the phenomenon of if you're, this also relates to the first point. If you're looking at, say, oxygen, oxygen in the air we breathe is about 21%, and yet having 100% oxygen in the air can be totally toxic. And so if you said, well, oxygen at 100% kills people, and then you say, well, we have 21% of the level that can easily kill people, then a huge number of people should be dropping dead every day if we just try to do these simplistic multiplication and division. I just thought, oh, he's just making this point, which is such a good point, and yet the wrong assumption is so present. Another one that's really big is, here's another assumption. He says, any stress is harmful to health and must be minimized. So this is the idea that this is related. It's that, well, anything that we put in the atmosphere is, it's that does anything to the body, stresses it in any way, must be harmful. And then he points out, well, but this is the opposite of what we find in many cases. Like with exercise, we're stressing the body to strengthen the body. And then there's a lot of findings in microbiology that you want to stress different parts of the immune system. When people are born on farms, they might have stronger immune systems, and that there are similar things with air quality. So if you put people in a clean room for days and days and days, then their ability to deal with any kind of particles or anything else becomes dramatically lower because certain cells regenerate and they can in a weak way without certain resistances. And then if you put them into the real world, people will be very much at risk. So he points out that certain amounts of natural contamination are inevitable in terms of the wind blowing dust or certain things in agriculture or fires. And thus, because certain amounts of emissions in the world are inevitable, that there's probably a baseline amount of emission that you want to be exposed to on a regular basis so that you're not so weak. And this is just this kind of thing. Who thinks about this? It makes so much sense when he says it, but I didn't even really think about this before. Another one, which just shows how pro-human he is, he questions the assumptions that, quote, natural chemicals are inherently safer than anthropogenic chemicals. And he points out that people are just acting with emissions. They'll just look almost exclusively at man-made emissions and then not look at all of the natural sources of emissions. And yet there are plenty of natural things that are way more dangerous than man-made things, and different kinds of natural emissions like ozone will often exist in much higher concentrations naturally than human beings add. But then if we say that they're too high, then we force us to reduce significant activities, like I think in this case, using diesel engines. And he just points out that you can't assume that something natural is safe and that something anthropogenic is unsafe. And yet so many experts in the field do this. Another one he says is, another assumption is contaminant concentrations can be controlled below levels that harm even sensitive individuals. So this is the idea that, well, we need to keep reducing amounts of emissions because at a certain point, and they'll point out, oh, there are certain people who are old or young or really sick, especially, and we want to save them. And yet he points out, well, for certain people, they're just sensitive to anything, to basically anything. And so those people have to take individual measures, and it's really, really damaging to do things to keep lowering emissions at large cost, which diminishes people's capability in every aspect of life because it diminishes their resources in the name of helping everyone, when you can't even help everyone in this kind of generalized way. So I thought that was a fascinating thing. And another one is contaminants should be isolated and regulated one by one as a means of protecting health. So this I found really interesting. So just that, oh, we should focus on sulfur dioxide and focus on different nitrogen oxides. And he's very focused particularly I think in his current thinking on when you're considering restricting something, you need to look at the full context, the total impact of that restriction, and see what its overall consequence is on human life. And so if you're just saying, oh, well, here's what sulfur dioxide should be in a vacuum, that's very problematic because you're not looking at cost benefit, and also you're not looking at what happens to other kinds of contaminants, certain ones where you lower one, it ends up raising others. And then the final one of the assumptions that he has here, and there are tons of others he questions in the book, but this is just this one section, is, quote, the most recent science is the best science, unquote. And this I found totally fascinating because he just goes into the point that cutting edge science is often a total mess, because when people are proposing recent findings and doing new experiments, there's so many things that can go wrong. There hasn't been the rigorous study and questioning and back and forth and verification, replication, all of these different things that exist in science. When you're dealing with the most recent science, it has the potential to advance science, but at any given point, it can be by far not the thing that you want to pay attention to. And yet there's this idea that, oh, let's pay attention to this cutting edge study on air pollution or on climate. And his point of view is, no, you really need to rethink that. You want to be dealing with established science, and then you want to be looking at the full context. So this is just, I don't feel like I've done justice at all to this book. So I'll just say that this guy is really remarkable in terms of how he's just got this incredible expertise and rigor, but then he has this broader thinking method where he's looking at issues in terms of a pro-human perspective. He's looking at the full context of everything, and he's got an incredible amount of precision. So I'm not sure that this book will be interesting to everyone, but I certainly would recommend looking him up on YouTube. And I'm hoping I can interview him for my book and also for for a future episode of Power Hour, because I really do find him to be a unique mind today. So we should definitely take advantage of him. Stefan, I know that how much of Phalen have you read so far? I know that you watched a little bit.
I watched the same videos that you recommended. I haven't read the book yet, but I've also watched some other videos by him, but were not as good as the one that you mentioned. But I really enjoy his thinking and explaining, and the way he views this issue with much expertise and a different angle than normally regulators take.